Right, is this working? It is, great. Right, a very good morning to everybody. Clive Johnstone has been explained. It's my great joy and risk, I suppose, to present this panel. If the Minister, Manu, gave a really brilliant speech, if I could say so, thank you. And I know Ben will back that up. I will challenge a little bit, and I will take us into one or two pieces of choppy waters where perhaps we might be seducing ourselves, and perhaps we need to talk slightly more directly about things. So forgive me, I recognise that the excellence of the integrated review and its follow-on, both of which were excellent documents. But I think we need to talk about one or two things, because if we are going to talk about the art of the Admiralty, I think we need to talk about that honestly and not seduce ourselves. To take on this journey, I'm in awe of Victoria and James in putting together a really, really strong panel, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But we've spoken, and you will recognise their faces up here, but I've asked them to be provocative and challenging as well, not to allow us to get off the hook and fall into conference speak. So if they're a little bit thorny, I've asked them to be, and please take on the baiting questions and afterwards. And talking about afterwards, I'm enormously proud to be the chairman of the Naval Review. The Naval Review was I'd like to say, a leading maritime publication. It probably was a leading maritime publication about 15 years ago when we kind of went to sleep. And myself and my very excellent chief executive, Mike Beardle, who will be well known to many, have been working really quite hard to turn it round into a publication that will carry this debate into the future. And literally hot off the press, and with a smudges of ink, that is the new publication coming out with a totally new style, new writing, new authors. If I may take the liberty, it's expensive. And if anybody would like to help me fund it, please, so we can carry on the debate, that's great. That's a bit cheeky, isn't it? Right, let's get on with the panel. So Victoria and James and everybody who's put this on, congratulations, First Sea Lord. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak and address you. I think the first thing is what worries me about the art of the Admiralty, if we are going to the steel component of it, is we are talking about what we're doing in a very grown-up way. We're talking about how we're going about it, because the people going about it are excellent, but we're doing it with ever smaller fleets. We're doing it with ever less resources. Rather than having frigates or destroyers around the Pacific, we have two small patrol vessels. The lethality of that is not lost to anybody. And as we're putting fleets together to be in the Mediterranean, be in the Atlantic, to have a presence either against the Chinese or the Russians or anybody else, it's really tough. And I suspect the First Sea Lord is not the only head of Navy across the world who continues to have to wrangle both resources and in terms of finance and resources in terms of people. If we really have turned the corner, and we are in a maritime century, and if we really have turned the corner and are threats seriously, why is it so particularly difficult to back that up? And I will challenge you that size, lethality and presence is missing. I've been doing a little bit of work about Chinese research growth at the moment for the company I represent, BMT Limited. And if you look at any figure of Chinese research growth, they outmatch us in many cases 100 to 1, not 10 to 1, and are starting to get into technologies and the leading technologies which are really quite a concern. And while we may have been surprised by the lack of lethality of the Russians of Ukraine, albeit the battle that takes forward, we mustn't be seduced by what the next war might feel like, because it's going to be very, very different. So I've got a hypothesis, if I may, which I'll back up with a sort of step ladder of points before I hand over to the speakers. I don't think it's a very provocative one, I regret. And I think if we are going to talk honestly about the art of the Admiralty, we need to close with this hypothesis and recognise that we haven't yet turned the corner. If you look at my top four as a policymaker concerns climate change and environmental disasters, the containment of peer competition and conflict, the impact of austerity on Europe caused by Russia, and also the sort of, and this is not a political comment, though it'll come out as a political comment, the populism of our politics and the inability to have a proper conversation with people, then I would say that on all of those four factors, we're slipping. We are not holding ground, but we are losing ground. The environment is getting worse. And as a result, social instability is creeping ever closer to us. Just look at the migration issues we're watching. I think China is a real concern if we have to go and match them, even with our partners and a coalition right across the region. And we need to think about that. Austerity will be with us, regrettably, for a significant period of time, given inflation and interest rates, and the inability to have a conversation with people, to educate them, to step them through things, and the time to do that. I was massively reassured by the minister's speech because it shows he deeply understands it. But I wonder how many other people really deeply understand it. So my first challenge would be this understand question. And Admiral Ben talked about sea blindness. But I wonder if the Royal Navy has city blindness or macroeconomic blindness or trade route blindness. When I left the Navy, I was quite shocked how the world really worked. And I was patted on the head and allowed to saunter off and be a pompous wazzock. But actually, the real people were making the deals, and the real people were hustling. And the partners they were hustling with weren't our friends, because they needed to convert money for their shareholders. So I wonder if we understand that and shape our naval policy around that. I equally wonder, and this worries me deeply, whether we understand those nations who are non-aligned and may not disagree with us, and maybe have a vestige of Commonwealth anxiety based on our past history. And are we talking to them in a way that we can elicit at least a sense of understanding, if not help? I think we still talk very arrogantly about how we go about our business, and still believe we can cruise in with an aircraft carrier and a multinational fleet, and everybody should listen to us. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not how democracy works or diplomacy works. We need to talk differently with and to people. And then I don't think we're in a proper conversation with and an understanding of academia and what academia can do. I had the great pleasure of visiting 2 or 3 universities in their black programs to work out how they could help the maritime industries across the piece. And they are thinking very differently from us, and they are losing funding because of our European journey. So if we do want to compete, and we do want the best minds on this, then certainly in the UK, we've got to take education and R&D very differently. The second thing I think we need to do is engage the right people in the conversations. And this goes back to Ben's sea blindness point. Time is a real factor here, and every First Sea Lord and every Chief of Staff will tell you there's just not enough time to fight the battles they have to fight and then sit down and have the proper conversations with people. So how do we give them time? Or, ladies and gentlemen, how do we create time in our own time to help them? This is not a conference. This is a contract we're forming to try to help the navies do better. And so if you are listening to this, I expect you to take it away and add to the conversation, please. That's important. The third thing, which I think is a real thing that hamstrings us at the moment, is the number of voices having the maritime or this conversation or that conversation. I was trying to work out, actually, because I wanted to go and see the minister, how many people are talking to her, and I got past 150 trade organisations before I just got bored and wandered off. If 150 trade organisations are talking to policymakers, no wonder they don't have time for them. We're going to have to consolidate our voice. We're going to have to think cleanly and clearly so that it is heard. And in this vein, I think industry, we've got to work out how to have a different conversation. Yes, you need to make the bottom line. Yes, the cost of entry to be in big prime programs is very, very costly. But the prime to tier 2 to tier 3 contract has to change. You can't have ships being competed in batches of 3 or 5. I'm afraid it just gets too costly. For a little company such as mine, a major bid takes all the investment money away so that we can bid and hold people on the benches to wait. If you're a bigger company, it's a bigger number. And the only way you can do it is either making bigger profits or taking money off the markets. And that's expensive at the moment. So how do we have a different construct, a different framework in industry to help the age of the Admiralty? The next one that worries me equally deeply is our employment propositions are just wrong. I'm very proud to be the National President of the Royal British Legion. They have a workforce that is completely mixed, and they cherish disabled people to come and help work it. Now, it's a charity, but I saw the most extraordinary range of disablement in a very swanky office in central London, driving a charity forward that has something like 600 million pounds in reserve. It's a big business. So why aren't we using all the talents? Why are we still so stuck? And why is it still so difficult for women in all of our services to make progressions? Why is it so difficult to be gay, to be pink, to be black, to be blue, to be dotted, to be spotted? It is still really, really hard to progress through. And we just need to be terrorists. And I mean that actively. We need to blow up ceilings. We need to break things. Because if we want to get everybody of talent into the workforce to help us with this, we've got to think differently about it. And finally, to pick up on Admiral Ben's point of steel, a conversation that I was having just before I left Marcom with General Scaparotti was, do we really understand what we need if we are going to be fighting for our values? And do we understand the cost of liberty and what it means? I think we understand better because of Ukraine, and we can see what it takes to be brave and hold the line. But do you think our populations can do that? I'm not sure. And are we educating them to be able to do that? So, enough from me. I've got a panel I want you to listen to, and they're a panel. So Andrew Lambert is, Professor Andrew Lambert is well known to you. He is the Laughton Professor of History at King's College, Cambridge. He's an author, he's been on TV. He is certainly a coach to many of us who've gone through the Navy, and a friend and a teacher and a guide to a whole raft of people who are interested in maritime history. But I would just pick out a couple of things. If you haven't got on your shelf, and if you are not reading his book, The British Way of War, I think you need to go and buy it, either from Waterston's or Amazon. It is one of the best 5 books I've read on leadership, on how to think, on strategy or whatever. It sits on my desk alongside Lord Allenbrook's diaries as a book to refer to constantly. And the other book I would strongly recommend you go out and buy is his book on the Crimean War. If you want to have a view of a different way of fighting, especially when we're looking at Turkey and everything else going on in Turkey, I would just go and buy it now. René Tass, sadly, hasn't got any books to recommend, but he is the commander of the Royal Netherlands Navy. He's a great friend, but he's a hugely experienced mariner, command in NATO, command at sea, command in policy and operational areas. And usefully for this conversation, he's very familiar with the Indo-Pacific. He's deployed there, and he's been a very active advocate of information sharing, of how we can blend a maritime picture to help everybody, including fishing fleets, and exactly as the Minister protein. Monica Cole is, she just got bored. She trained in the UK as a solicitor, India as a barrister, and then Copenhagen because she just hadn't had enough. She's a specialist in maritime law. She's a senior lawyer of Gard UK. If you don't understand what Gard is, they are the largest of the protection indemnity clubs, insurance for the commercial shipping area. And she's 100% busy with that. She's also president of the Women in Shipping and Trade Association, and she's the chair of the Anglo-Indian Trade Association. So she sleeps for suckers. And finally, we're blessed with having Jason Wrigley, and they will talk in this order. Jason is a senior hood in Lockheed. We're very lucky to have him because he literally just jumped off an aircraft. He was at the launch of the latest Aegis destroyer, the USS Lena Sutcliffe Higsby, rather appealingly numbered DDG 123. But he was there, of course, because of the Aegis program. But he's here because probably more than many, he's really thinking of how he can help Admiral Mike Gilday build agility, build lethality, build capability in stride to compete in the Indo-Pacific threat. And so he will have something to say about how you do that and the sort of investment capital you need. So that's it. End of the pompous wazik. I hope this will be a really great panel, great panelists. So if I could ask Andrew to take the reins. Over to you, Andrew.
So Ben, honoured guests, Victoria and James, who've put all of this together, it's a great honour to stand here and have an opportunity to talk about why history still matters. As a professor of history, I often get asked why we bother, and the answer is it's packed full of things that we can learn from. We shouldn't copy the past, we shouldn't be prisoner of the past, but the past is the way that we need to think forward. It gives us so much to start the conversation. Let me begin with the definition. While the art of the admiral concerns the leadership of navies in war and peace, the art of admiralty is the sustained effort to place the maritime dimension at the heart of the national conversation, to discuss economics, strategy, cultural life, to foster the conditions that sustain what I would call a sea power state, a state that faces the sea boldly and positively. We depend upon the sea, we must engage with the sea, and we must make it central to our identity because we depend on the food that comes across the sea, the energy that we import. We depend on those connections for almost everything. Nothing that we do is unaffected by the sea. And in this small country, you'd have a hard job being more than 90 miles away from it. It does make a difference. The art of admiralty privileges the oceanic and the outward-facing vision over the terrestrial and the domestic. It changes the narrative. It's a national project, and it requires dedicated long-term support. And I'm going to argue that it did have that support throughout many centuries in this country, and we need to think about how to replicate it. Selling sea power, however, has of course never been easy. Sir Julian Corbett, great maritime strategist of the early 20th century, observed, and I quote, "Since men live upon the land," end quote, "they naturally assume it's the more important element, and that the obvious response to anything that happens on land is to operate on land." That is missing the point. The great advantage of being a maritime state is asymmetric, not symmetric. You do not have to think about engaging with large continental powers. You think about how to engage them without playing their game. Playing the Russians at fighting on land is not a good idea. There are better ways and better games to play. So if Britain is a maritime connected state, a sea power state, what messaging does it need? Well, it needs that messaging to be consistent, to be permanent. It needs that messaging to have a dedicated centre within the state. For 500 years, the British Admiralty was that centre. The men who ran the Admiralty, the civil servants, the politicians, and even occasionally the naval officers who were directing it strategically and militarily, took part in a massive messaging operation. They delivered those ideas. They maintained that agenda. At the heart of it were not the sailors who passed through on fairly short term, but the civil servants who were there permanently. If you were an Admiralty civil servant, that was your entire career track. You didn't go off to another civil service department. You stayed in that one department, and its enormous influence and power resonated across Whitehall. So it's the sustained development and promotion of a coherent, positive and holistic long-term approach to the nation's engagement with the sea. It's also a cultural concept. The sea is central to the city that we are in today. It was used to underpin the creation and promote the maintenance of the British state, and it engaged all of its elements. It helped to shape force levels. It focused the Navy's concentration on the defence of trade. It shaped many things. This art is not new, and it is not uniquely British. The ancient Athenians were doing this in a very sophisticated way. So were the medieval Venetians and the 17th century Dutch Republic. These are sea power states who think about the ocean and make it central because it makes them much more powerful than they would be if they played the normal game. Having established a language of global power, Britain maintained the peace with other powers by publicly announcing the assembly of a fleet, not by threatening the use of an army. The mobilisation of a fleet at Spithead long before continuous at-sea deterrence gave Britain leverage. It caught the attention of other countries. And the primary weapon of that fleet was not, as you might imagine, artillery. It was ideas. The thing that really frightened Britain's opponents across the last 300 years is liberal democracy, inclusive government, the kind of things that are still a bit of a problem for some countries around the world. That synergy of naval power and open democratic processes is very significant. In 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada made naval glory the foundation myth of the English nation. And in 1805, Trafalgar made it the British nation's foundation myth. If you're in the centre of London, you are in Trafalgar Square, and you are looking at a column which celebrates the connection with imperial glory dating all the way back to Rome. So the synergy of fleet strategy, politics, economics and culture is negotiated with the nation. The defence of floating trade brings the City of London on board. The support of the Navy from the city is critical. So it's the long-term mobilisation of strength. Providing naval support for merchant ships in troubled regions is a very good way of engaging a very large and important audience. At home, of course, the seapower state, a liberal democracy, was infinitely preferable to standing armies and absolute monarchs. So in 1688, we threw out the king, who happened to be a very good admiral, and replaced him with a Dutch general, who did a better political deal, and we moved forward on that basis. That partnership between Crown and Parliament meant that the Royal Navy was actually owned by the House of Commons, but it's much more dignified to be royal than parliamentary. It worked because it was sustained by an admiralty organisation dedicated to reminding everybody all of the time just how important it was. Admiralty officials created modern naval history. The first English language histories of Navy were written by men like Samuel Pepys, Admiralty Secretary, and his successor, Josiah Burchard, and his successor, Thomas Corbett. For over 70 years, the Admiralty Secretary wrote naval operational history and delivered it to the public as part of that messaging. The Navy also collected seapower art. It constructed imposing buildings, iconic ships of war, and communicated directly with key stakeholders. This was very much at the centre of government. It was not auxiliary. The vital need to sustain the messaging meant that an enduring admiralty, rather than any individual, remained critical to the seapower state for as long as it existed. In 1964, the Admiralty was abolished as part of the creation of the Ministry of Defence at a time when the focus was on the Cold War, on nuclear weapons and the inner German border. Without an obvious home within government, sea power messaging faltered, replaced by that British condition we know as sea blindness. Those of us old enough to remember 1982 may recall just how quickly those messages were revived, not least by Sir Henry Leach, alongside a potent demonstration of why they were needed and just what was possible. Sea blindness is a national problem, far beyond the reach of academics. And I must say my own profession has been strikingly uninterested in taking up that challenge. All think tanks and policy fora, the permanence, the centrality of the old Admiralty model is the thing that we need to look for. How we do that, I'm not entirely sure, but do it we must. The Royal Navy has the advantage, unlike most navies, of being the senior service, but it must not, in this domain, remain the silent service for too much longer. Ultimately, sustaining sea power identity in times of peace as well as war might ensure the next crisis did not meet the same unreflective response as the current one. That land aggression must be addressed at the point of contact and necessarily by soldiers. This is not the British way. The British way would suggest there are better and more relevant forms in which we can do this. Sea power messaging has not recovered since 1964. It is better now than it was, but it needs to be upgraded. It needs to achieve a degree of permanence. The art will be essential to sustain any notion of a global Britain alongside key alliances with regional partnerships like NATO and AUKUS. We have to project that message because we are not going to project a message of being a great continental military power. That is not what Britain has ever been. We must play to our strengths and not try to create a model that looks remarkably like a small version of somebody else's military posture. It needs sustained central direction. and it needs to reach those key audiences day after day. We have much to learn, I would argue, from our predecessors. Thank you very much.
And you know how important history is and how we forget it. I now want to go and read all the papers around 1964-65 to understand what the difference is. So, Andrew, thank you. Next in the panel is René to talk about his perspective, and I've asked him particularly, you know, if he can, and there's risk in this, I recognise, but be critical of us. Bigger navies, not much bigger sadly now, and other bigger navies, so that we can draw the lessons of how to handle allies in a slightly different way.
It's going to be difficult after the superb keynote of Madam Minister, and I think your introduction as well, Clive, because you solved most of the problems that were mentioned by the Minister, or the challenges, I should say. Steel and statecraft, it's a strong combination, and as we sit here, we're all part of that combination, and that makes us responsible for solving challenges we see ahead of us. Yes, we live indeed in a transformational time, and a changing power balance, a war at the very heart of Europe, but at the same time, we as NATO and EU partners are more united than ever, and that's good news. And this is important because what we are doing, and we should do what we have done in the past and should do in the future, is protect what we value. And what is it that we value? That's our values themselves, our security, freedom, prosperity, and well-being. And without maritime power, there is no shipping, there is no shopping, there is no reinforcement, and there is no global influence and global power. And as you know, the Netherlands is a small country, geographically, but with only 17 million people, we are the 17th economy in the world because of the maritime domain. And I think for other nations, the maritime domain is playing an equally important role. And without maritime power, no autonomy, I think. In the maritime domain, as in the cyberspace domain, by the way, and the space domain, of course, our security does not start and stop at the borders of the North Sea or the EU or the NATO area of responsibility. It is global in nature. I think we've mentioned that several times. So it is important that we jump in where the maritime domain is threatened, whether that be the North Sea, the Atlantic, the Pacific, or the Persian Gulf, for instance. That's one we should not forget. And freedom, security, and prosperity can only be achieved by closely cooperating with international allies and partners, and standing by friends that share our values and need our support most in troubled times. And I think our support to Ukraine is an example of this. The key word, I think, and the magic word is together, but there is no single nation that can do it alone. Although we still think and we sometimes still act as if we can do it alone. And I think it's perhaps a logical thing to do, but I think it's a big mistake, and we make it over and over again. And now with a renewed focus on credible deterrence and defense, I think our Navy, the Netherlands Navy, is optimizing the fleet and Marine Corps again for war fighting, and looking closer to home, North Sea, but also farther away the Pacific for potential battlefields. What we do, and I refer back to innovation, is transitioning our Marine Corps to a special operations capable force that will conduct dispersed operations ashore with a minimal logistical footprint. That's another one we need to strive for. And dedicated long-range fires. Don't be a sitting duck. Don't let them come to you. Make sure that you take them far away. The new mine warfare vessels will be standoff vessels. They will use autonomous systems above water, underwater, in the air. We will acquire new anti-submarine frigates, new air defense frigates, new submarines, all with state-of-the-art missile and weapon systems. And I can go on discussing many more projects that we currently run. But in general, we should do it more with other nations. And it's hard. I've experienced myself over the last 3-4 years in my previous job. in NATO, but now as a Navy chief as well. It's almost impossible to get within one nation people on the same table for industry. It's even harder to get many nations together on the same table, and still we need to do it. We're going to lose autonomy. And look at what happened with the commercial shipping. But everything is being built in China now. What does it do with our autonomy? What does it do with our logistics? What does it do with our workforce? What does it do with our knowledge base? It's bad, and we should do something about it. And we just discussed it in the Netherlands, and we agreed to, well, we in the process of making a glossy, look what's being made in the Netherlands in the maritime domain, how beautiful it is to educate people, but also to trigger young people, to trigger parents of young people. Look what we gonna miss if we don't do something about it. But if we do it in the Netherlands, it's not good enough, because the Netherlands is too small to solve the problems by itself. So we should do I think an EU or a NATO or whatever endeavor to make sure that we bundle our forces to make sure that we can win this competition and not lose it by looking at ourselves only. And I was talking to some ship owners a couple of weeks ago, and they say, well, we are happy to pay 10 to 15% more if we can build a ship in Europe instead of China. So I said, why don't you do that? Because all kind of regulations, the banking system is not cooperating. China does. The Chinese banks don't have difficulties with subsidizing whatever they're making. They don't have all kind of regulations that is hampering us. And I think it's not only applicable for the commercial shipping, it's hampering us ourselves as well in the Navy business. Look how long it takes to make requirements and build something. We are not helping ourselves. I think it's coming back from the last 20 years where cutbacks in defense budgets were normal. We were only looking at efficiency and not at effectiveness. We should turn that around from over control in front of whatever we do to mission command and control at the end of the process and not before we even start the process. We do something wrong there. Okay, where was I? Anyway, it's I think again together is the magic word here, and it's important for us as NATO partners to share our ideas, share intelligence, conduct realistic exercises as well, not just with navies but also with the commercial fleet. Start up doing more serious business on multi-domain operations, because we talked about it, but we haven't started yet to the full extent, I think. And use new disruptive and emerging technologies, AI. Everybody's talking about AI. Somebody are worrying about AI. It's there to stay, and I think we should put it more into practice. That's something we're doing as well. And we're going to skip a whole part because it has been said by you, Madam Minister. And of course, yes, as I said, the threat is global, so we should act global. But still, the North Atlantic, let's not forget it, it ties the US and Canada to the European part of NATO, and in many ways, by the way, not just because it's a sea between us, but it's the way we share values, we share the view of the rule of law. And of course, it connects our economies. So we should never forget the North Atlantic and take it for granted. Some people do. Okay, skip this part as well. Then, it will be no surprise. I think thinking globally, and we had a discussion in the Netherlands as well, because nowadays we're looking, because of the Nord Stream incident, looking at the North Sea and close to Europe. But I think the enemies will hit us where we are vulnerable. And in my opinion, it's two parts. It's our command and control. That's one. So we're talking about the cabling on the seabeds, the communication cables. And the second one is our cohesion, the cohesion within the alliance. And I think if you want to touch the cohesion, touch the populations. Now, how do you touch the populations? By killing the economies. And that's being easily done as well. Where? At sea. What would happen if somebody would sink 2 or 3 LNG tankers mid-Atlantic, even before a war starts? What would happen if the economy would not go on for half a week? What would our populations do? So I think we are vulnerable at sea, and we should look together again, not nations alone, but together. So going to the Admiralty, I'm not sure if the word Admiralty is the right word, because it looks a bit like earlier days as well. Perhaps we need something new for it. But what is for me is sure that we need a grand strategy. I think every nation would need a grand strategy, but I think as a bunch of nations, as allies, partners, we need some sort of grand strategy as well. And in that, navies have a role to play. Definitely. I'm not sure if navies have a leading role in bringing together all maritime entities within a nation, but at least they should have a strong coordinating role. And I think I will conclude there. Thank you.
So now with a very different take from a very different perspective. Monica, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be speaking to all of you. And I'll tell you exactly why I'm delighted in a few minutes. Before I tell you that, I need to tell you a bit about myself. And I think you will understand why my delight is so much. I'm going to stop saying delight. Anyway, I come from a merchant navy background. My father was a sailor. He was the captain of a ship. And the first 5 years of my life, I spent on board the ship. So I pretty much was brought up on board. I didn't go to school. I only came ashore when my brother was born. And I still resent him for that. But as you can imagine, this young girl on the ship, Daddy was the captain, he was my hero, and that's pretty much all I wanted to be. And that's pretty much all I thought I would be till I was 16. And I had to choose a career. And then I grew up in India, unsurprisingly to most of you. Just look at me or hear me. I hadn't seen a single female seafarer. I hadn't seen a woman sailing, and I don't think anyone actually said to me, Monica, you can't be a captain or you can't join the sea. But it was so apparent everywhere I looked that no woman had ever gone to sea. So I kind of knew I wouldn't have to go to sea, or I couldn't go to sea. And I did maritime law, and that's how I joined. But what I did know is that I would be a part of the maritime world. That was certain in my head, and I'm here today. Maybe it would have been the same path through the sea. But a part of me is so delighted to see Admiral Jude, or see all of you here in your uniforms, and still see even one woman is enough, because even one woman makes a difference. If I had seen one woman when I was 16, I would have been on the sea. I wasn't, but that's different. I'm hoping that never happens to any other girl ever again. And we are seeing a change, of course. The IMO Medal for Bravery in 2016 went to Captain Radhika Menon, an Indian female captain. So that's brilliant to see. We are seeing in the Merchant Navy 2% of women seafarers. 2%. You may say, oh my God, 2% falling with COVID. But I say 2%, that's great. From zero in my lifetime, 2% is great. And what I really like is when I saw the statistics for the Royal Navy, it's 10%, 5 times more. That's amazing. So we can learn from that. And I think we have to look at the positives. Don't look at only 10% or only 2%, but look at where we've come from. And of course, we can work together and we can, go to the actual figure, which should be 50%, of course. And I see that the Navy is doing a lot. I read about it and I see role models. So of course, they are. So that's my first hat that Sir Clive spoke about. I'm president of Women in Shipping and Trade Association. It's a 50-year-old association. The founders still talk about how they were told, go home and have babies, don't come to the city, don't come to work, you're taking away man's job. 50 years ago, things have changed. I don't think anyone would say it. Some people may think it, but no one would actually say it. So that's a huge change in our lifetime, my lifetime at least, or whatever little I've seen of it. Today is also serendipitously, as some of you may know, 2 days before the IMO declared Women in Maritime Day. And the slogan for this year is Mobilizing Networks for Gender Equality. So it's wonderful. We're all talking about mobilizing networks. One has to mobilize networks. One cannot do it alone. One has to do it with allies. And I see a lot of allies here around the world. I have a second hat. I'm chair of the Indian Maritime Association UK. I've spoken to the naval attaché today from India, and he said, you know, whatever we inherited the bureaucracy from here, but we have perfected it in India. So we have seen bureaucracy, we have seen growth, but what I'm trying to say is that there is similarity. There's similarity of cultures, there's similarity of ways we work, and I would like to see a bit more of a growth, a bit more of a build in that, not just with India, but more of the Commonwealth. There's still a respect, a regard, an understanding of how things work. There's a passion in India for the navies, there's a passion for the way people do work. So I think that's something that the Royal Navy should be very proud of. The armed forces, not just the Royal Navy, but all the armed forces should be very proud of. Leadership is really, really highly respected, valued, and wanted in the city. We spoke about it a bit earlier with Sir Clive, and we did discuss that maybe commercial awareness is something we could work on. But we can build on that. It works on both sides. So my last hat, which is the one that pays for all the other hats, is of course that I'm a lawyer in a P&I club. So I've been doing this for 25 years. I am older than I look, I know. So so that's what that's my main role. And as a lot of you have mentioned and are aware, 90% of goods come from the sea. We're an island nation, but 90% of our population is not even aware of this. They don't even apply for the jobs. The port sector is struggling. I'm also Maritime Skills Commissioner with Sam, and we're working to get all the schools and colleges talking about it. I find it surprising that every kid doesn't immediately say, I want to go to sea. Royal Navy, Merchant Navy, doesn't matter. We want to be working together. 90% of contracts are in English law. That means the services in the city are still primal to the world. People are still coming here for all their contracts. I think we need to work together to make this a lot more awareness of this industry generally in the industry. I also don't know whether everyone is aware, and I'm sure some of you must have been there when there was the big piracy. There was a lot of piracy on the east coast of Africa, and goods were not traveling. All these iPhones that I see around you were not arriving in time. Energy was not arriving from Gulf of Aden to the east coast of the United States, which is one of the main trade routes. At that point, the reason goods could travel was because of the maritime convoys. The Maritime Combined Forces around the world got together, formed convoys, and that's the only reason why commercial vessels could sail. These convoys, if you could put your mind and think, if even one of those vessels were owned by any other company, Twitter had one ship there. Do you imagine that anyone wouldn't know that they were there helping the world get their goods to their doorstep? Maybe we need to see the Royal Navy talk a little bit more about what they do, how they get goods to our doorstep, how much they help us really get everything on our doorstep, the food we eat, fruits out of season, so much avocado, everything that comes to our doors, everything that lights our houses, everything that runs our homes. It comes from the seas. In the Royal Navy, the maritime world, the commercial Navy, we all work together to make that happen. So with my three hats, I hope I've told you a bit about how we process in the city, how the Royal Navy works, and how we'd like to see more of a collaboration, and how we'd like to see more of the skills translated from the Navy to the city. Thank you very much.
Now, with supreme elegance, we've bounced off the commerciality aspects and the need to think differently both ways. And we have now Jason Wrigley. More interestingly, he's absolutely on the cutting edge of making capability agile and building lethality into the Indo-Pacific. So, Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Sir Clive. So I'll speak to what we're hearing from our governments, from our Admiralty, and specifically how we're responding as industry, and in my case, from a point of view, developing naval combat systems and launchers for the U.S. Navy. So the minister spoke earlier and spoke strongly about the Indo-Pacific. It's absolutely what we see as the driving challenge of our time. And from an American point of view, the US government is viewing everything right now, even including the Ukraine conflict, through an Indo-Pacific lens. How likely is China to invade Taiwan? The Indo-Pacific is a maritime theater. Any conflict there is led by the Navy. And so it has reminded us of that connection between maritime power and our national objectives. So I just want to talk about a couple of examples that we as industry are addressing in providing the industrial base and the human resource to support those national objectives through the systems that we produce and deliver. So in the United States, it's the Aegis weapon system fielded on destroyers and cruisers that has guaranteed the safety of our aircraft carriers, really the symbol of maritime power projection and sea power, certainly in the US and I believe in the UK as well. The hallmark of the Aegis program since the earliest days has been to pace the threat from air defense to ballistic missile defense and most recently to hypersonic missile defense. But the pace of the threat advancement has changed dramatically with China's rapid naval buildup. In addition to the number of ships they're fielding, they and also Russia are fielding very advanced weapons. And so that increasing paces of competitor threats has led the admirals of the US Navy to focus on increasing capability, capacity, and also speed. So two things we're focused on right now. The first is taking the next evolution in the Aegis program, achieving what the US Navy calls the Integrated Combat System, or ICS. There are operational goals to the ICS, but what I want to focus on here is the one that's most impactful and frankly stressing to industry, the speed element. The ICS goal around speed is to develop and deliver new capability every 90 days. It means we have a continuous software development pipeline that goes to all capable platforms every 3 months. That's a massive change to what today is a multi-year development process, and that means changing the way we develop and deliver capabilities. We're certainly investing significantly. It's caused us to re-architect our systems to make them more componentized, to virtualize and fully separate the software from the underlying hardware, to look to commercial industry for development processes that we can onboard. But as much as it's a technical challenge, it's a cultural one. It's required us to reorganize our teams and kind of rename and eliminate the separation between system engineers and software engineers. It's also caused us to have to recognize that all good ideas don't come from just one company. And we've had to cast a wider net across industry, small and large, to find innovation and bring it in wherever we can find it. Speaking to my colleagues at BAE Systems here in the UK, I can conclude that this is not a unique issue to the US. We're not there yet. We're in the middle of this kind of major transformation, but in order to sustain the sorts of change that we're seeking here, we need to overcome challenges to attract and retain employees to the defense and security industry, as Sir Clive talked about earlier. We also have a long way to go to align contracting approaches to achieving the desired outcomes. The other example I wanted to highlight today is related to building capacity and lethality. So the Mark 41 vertical launch system is being delivered now to the Royal Navy's Type 26 ships, as well as many other ships around the world. It's a multi-mission system capable of firing a whole range of missiles for strike, air and missile defense, anti-submarine warfare, helping navies become as lethal as they can be. The challenge from our admirals was how do we enable distributed maritime operations and expand missile firing capacity for the surface fleet. Recognizing we in the West can't keep pace with the China's shipbuilding rate, how could we increase the lethality of the ships and the assets that we already have? So what we did was we worked to repackage that Mark 41 into a shipping container form factor. And the US Navy has demonstrated the ability to deploy missile launch capability to non-traditional platforms. Any ship with 9 square meters of available deck space can take one of these pods. We're also now delivering the same capability called the Mark 70 launcher to the US Army and the US Marine Corps, allowing them to rapidly deliver and deploy offensive capability. So this has the makings of a success story, but in order to get there, we had to actually move outside of our traditional service acquisition structures and go under the guidance of the US's Strategic Capabilities Office, which was formed to really look across and to cultivate these sort of rapid prototyping ideas and bring them to the fleet. So yes, naval power is key to our national interests. but it's challenged more than it ever has been before and requires us as both government and industry to move faster and creatively to achieve the desired outcomes. Thank you.
Wow, that was interesting. Thank you. Okay, we've got about half an hour. We've exactly got half an hour for questions and for conversation, please. I don't know if we have microphones or people just got to stand up and shout. We have microphones. We have microphone holders. Brilliant. But I've got a live chat in front of me, and I'm just watching to see if anybody wants to pose a question online. I can see people joining and going. They're clearly going to get a cup of coffee off to Starbucks and back. But if a question pops up there, I'll use it. But I will reserve the right to ask 2 questions if I might. And the first is broadly of Andrew, but of everybody. Reading the UK MOD strategic trends work and the strategic trends work my team have been doing, we are observing a move offshore of more and more capability, whether it's deep sea mining, fish farming, whether it is hosting servers offshore, or actually the protection of assets, and then you've got wind farms and the rest of it. Andrew, I wondered if you saw our relationship changing with the sea, and the sea will now become an extension of the land. And if we are going to think like that, how do the service chiefs here reset their navies to both have the lethality but be able to protect? And if I could ask you to answer that, and then I've got one probably more at Jason, but grateful for any thoughts.
Thank you very much for that. I think the obvious starting place for a historian would be backwards. The engagement with the sea has extended and extended across time, and navies have adapted to meet the new challenge. It's not just a technological challenge, it's a coverage challenge, it's a communications challenge. And one of the things that particularly engaged me looking at the 19th century is how, as we transition from an age of wooden sailing ships to an age of steam capital ships connected up, there's a global network of communications, and that's a cable telegraph underwater network. It's a slightly different technology to the current underwater network, but it is the same concept. The telegraph companies who laid and ran those telegraphs and gave Britain communications dominance globally made sure that when they laid a cable, first they asked the Admiralty to survey the route to make sure it wasn't a rough and rocky bed that they would lay it on, which would lead to fractures. And then they made sure they laid it under the internationally recognized shipping lanes because they knew the Navy would be there in wartime to protect those communications. So it's about the intelligent engagement with evolving technologies, evolving demands. If we're going more and more offshore for wind, obvious, we need to be offshore with the assets to secure and protect that. We need to think about what people are doing now, but more importantly, what they are going to do going forward. And we can dip into the back catalogue and ask those questions. How did our predecessors deal with that? And it's very obvious they are ahead of the game. They are aware of the opportunities, and because they want to exploit that technology. A revolution in naval strategy occurs when you have global connectivity through a cable telegraph network. All of a sudden, the Admiral on station in Australia can get instructions from London, and that means you need a different Admiral, one who might listen and pay attention, or hopefully would know when to completely ignore the signal and do his own thing. The great art of the Admiral is knowing when to back your judgment and not to simply take instructions. And I think that's critical. So getting ahead of the game, what is changing? Where is it going? Where are we going to be in 20 years' time? And that's a bit of a wet finger in the air kind of moment. You know, where are we going? Well, we can see, but we don't know what's going to be critical going forward. So we need to be very much engaged with that and not waiting for things to fully mature and take them on board. The people who did this in the past did that, and we need to carry on doing that because catching up is much more painful than being ahead of the game.
Andrew, thank you. And there's something there about how we find time to have those conversations, to look out and dig through. The question I probably got, I think of Jason, but of the panel, is Jason, as you've gone for this 90-day cycle, which is really demanding and really exciting, and I can see all the pressures on it. Have you learned anything about a framework working with other companies? You talked about the culture change, and you talked about having to bring different people in. And if you had to pick out one or two lessons, what are the one or two lessons that you would pick out for the audience at the moment?
Thank you, Sir Clive. So for us, the advantage we have is not having to invent it. For the surface Navy, it's actually something that the subsurface community in the United States has been doing for a while on a program called the Acoustic Rapid COTS Insertion, ARCI. And so we were able to turn to those colleagues and try to understand what are the elements of success there. And so part of it is kind of embracing this ecosystem, inviting smaller businesses to come in, larger ones as well, but especially inviting the smaller ones. But what's also important, we kind of tend to see those small businesses as the providers of innovation. What they don't have, however, is the context, the challenge problem, the hardware and software that exist on the ship so that their innovations can be applied, in an operational context. And so what we see as our role as a system integrator and to facilitate that success is to provide that environment, to provide labs resources that have that hardware and the software, allow us to test and improve that capability in an environment, and then promote it into into systems for operational use.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I think we'll go outside and let other people ask questions and thoughts.